My name is Ava Miller. I'm 35 years old, a graphic designer by profession, and I live with my husband, David, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Austin, Texas. Our home sits on a calm, tree-lined street not far from Zilker Park. It's a modest ranch-style house, the kind people compliment without thinking twice about it. Neatly trimmed grass, rose bushes lining the walkway, white window frames that always seem freshly painted. People often say it looks peaceful, almost staged, like a picture pulled straight from a real estate brochure. What they don't see is that a house can look perfect on the outside while slowly cracking from within. David and I have been married for 16 years. We were young when we said our vows. I was 19, he was 22. Back then, I believed in forever without hesitation. He was my first real love, the first man who made me feel chosen. Our wedding took place in a small church in my hometown, surrounded by family and familiar faces. I remember standing there, holding his hands, thinking, this must be what happiness feels like. In a way, forever did happen, on paper at least. Reality has been more complicated. David works in the film industry as a production manager. His life is a constant cycle of locations, late-night shoots, industry events, and endless travel. At first, I loved hearing about it. The energy, the stories, the names he casually dropped over dinner. It all felt exciting, like we were connected to a bigger world. Over time, that world started to feel like a place I didn't belong. I work from home most days, designing layouts and campaigns for local agencies. My days are quiet, structured, solitary. I like routines. I like familiarity. We don't have children. In the beginning, that was a mutual choice. We wanted to build our careers first. Later, when the idea came back around, it felt like the window had quietly closed. Sometimes I grieve that. Other times, I'm grateful. Emotions don't always come neatly packaged. Our marriage exists in an in-between space. We still laugh, we still share habits, but something essential has thinned over the years. Trust doesn't feel automatic anymore. Comfort doesn't feel effortless. That Saturday morning, I woke before David. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the bedroom wall. I lay still, listening to his breathing, slow and steady beside me. I wondered if he ever lay awake the way I did, replaying thoughts he never said out loud. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, wrapped myself in a robe, and padded into the kitchen. The familiar sounds grounded me, the coffee machine humming, the faint scent of freshly ground beans. While I waited, I checked my phone. A message from my best friend, Jane. "How's your movie star doing? Come to the farmer's market with me today. You need a distraction." Jane always called him that, not because he was famous, but because he worked among people who were. She never quite trusted him. Too many late nights, too many attractive coworkers, too many excuses. I'd always brushed off her concerns. That morning, though, they echoed louder than usual. David shuffled into the kitchen moments later, hair messy, still half asleep, wearing nothing but his shorts. Without a word, he reached for his phone. "Morning," he muttered. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "You okay?" he asked, eyes fixed on the screen. "Yeah, fine. Just need to answer a few emails. New York wiped me out." "Of course," I said. Inside, a quiet irritation stirred. Always emails, always somewhere else. He noticed my tone and glanced up. "What?" "Nothing." He sighed. "Ava, we've talked about this. It's work." "I know," I said quickly. "I'm just going to clean the bathroom." He laughed lightly. "It's Saturday morning and you want to scrub tiles? You're unbelievable." "Someone has to do it." "Come have breakfast with me instead." "In a minute." I cleaned automatically, muscle memory guiding me. Sink, counter, shower. And then I saw it. A single blonde hair stuck to the shower wall. Not mine, not his. I froze. It was thin, pale, almost translucent in the light, but unmistakable. My heart began pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I have black hair. David has black hair. Relive alone. I stared at it as if it were evidence from a crime scene. Something small, something devastating. My hands felt hot inside the rubber gloves. I plucked the hair free, stared at it once more, then dropped it into the trash as if that could erase the moment. It didn't. "David," called David from the kitchen. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I answered too quickly. He appeared in the doorway seconds later, coffee in hand. "Do you look pale?" "I'm fine." "Maybe sit down instead?" "No, almost done." He watched me for a moment, then shrugged. "Just don't stress yourself out." He placed his cup on the counter and briefly rested his hand on my shoulder before leaving. I wiped the exact spot where the hair had been, my hands trembling. At breakfast, everything felt wrong. David moved easily, cracking eggs, talking about a walk in Zilker Park like nothing had changed. My fork hovered over the plate. My hands shook. "You okay?" he asked again. "Yeah." I wanted to ask him outright. I wanted to demand answers. Instead, I asked something safer. "Did you shower last night after I went to bed?" He blinked. "Yeah, why?" "No reason." He shrugged and kept eating. That hair replayed in my mind over and over. And as I sat there, forcing myself to smile, one thought settled deep in my chest. Something had shifted. And once that kind of doubt takes root, it doesn't stay quiet for long. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't accuse him. But from that moment on, I started paying attention, and what I noticed next would make that single blonde hair feel like only the beginning. After that morning, nothing looked the same anymore. On the surface, life went on exactly as before. David worked long hours, made calls, rushed out the door with his jacket half-buttoned. In the evenings, we sat across from each other at the dining table, talking about safe topics, work deadlines, errands, weekend plans that never quite materialized. But for me, the world had shifted by a few degrees, just enough to make everything feel off. I started noticing things I would have ignored before. David began placing his phone face down on the table, not dramatically, casually, as if it meant nothing at all. Before, it had always rested screen up, lighting up whenever a message came in. Now, it stayed dark. He spent longer in the bathroom at night. The shower ran. The fan hummed. Sometimes he even hummed along with it. Once, that would have seemed comforting. Now, it made my chest tighten. He shaved more often, even on days when he said he was just handling paperwork. All small details, all things that could be explained away. At night, I lay awake beside him while he slept deeply, his breathing calm and untroubled. I stared into the darkness, asking myself the same question over and over. Am I imagining this, or am I finally seeing what I refused to see before? 2 days later, I texted Jane. "Coffee? I need to get out of my head." Her reply came instantly. Always. We met at the Daily Grind Cafe. Crowded and noisy as usual. The smell of pastries filled the air. Jane was already there, sitting by the window, looking exactly like herself, confident, observant, impossible to fool. "You look tense," she said as I sat down. "Just work," I replied too quickly. She raised an eyebrow. "Work," she repeated. I stared into my cup, stirring the foam. "It's nothing concrete, just little things." "Little things," she echoed. I nodded. "You know when you suddenly start noticing details you never paid attention to before?" She didn't interrupt. A phone turned face down, someone smelling different, being more careful with appearances. Jane took a slow sip of her coffee. "Ghosts aren't usually ghosts," she said quietly. "Sometimes they've been standing in the room the whole time." Her words settled heavy between us. "You know him," she added gently. "You can tell when something changes. You're not imagining things." On the walk home, her voice echoed in my head, and I started keeping mental notes. Smells, smiles that didn't reach his eyes, the way he sometimes looked at his phone as if it held something private and precious. I said nothing. I watched. Then came the shampoo. I've used the same brand for years. Thick, dark, herbal. Comforting. David hated it. He always had. He used his own neutral body wash, and we'd kept that quiet division without ever discussing it. His shelf, my shelf. One evening, while showering, I noticed the bottle felt lighter.
I frowned, shook it. Too light. I told myself I was mistaken, that I'd misjudged, but the next day I paid closer attention. I placed it back carefully, pressing a faint mark into the plastic with my fingernail. 3 days later, the level had dropped. A chill ran through me. David would never use it. He couldn't stand the scent. He'd complained about it for years. I stood there holding the bottle, staring at the disappearing liquid like it was ticking down a clock only I could see. Someone else was using it. Someone else was standing where I stood, breathing in my steam, washing her hair with my shampoo. I felt like a stranger in my own home. That evening, Jane called. Wine? I didn't hesitate. We sat in a dim bar on Division Street, candles flickering on the tables. I told her about the shampoo, feeling ridiculous even as the words left my mouth. She listened carefully, then said, "So, either he's using it secretly, or someone else is." "And he wouldn't," I said immediately. "Then you already know." Her certainty scared me more than doubt ever had. That night, lying beside David, I made a decision. Quiet, cold, final. If I couldn't get the truth by asking, I'd force it into the open. The idea came to me suddenly, absurd at first. What if I made it impossible to ignore? The next morning, I went to the drugstore on Congress Avenue. Ordinary shelves, ordinary people. I stood frozen in front of the hair removal creams longer than I'd like to admit. Finally, I picked one up and buried it beneath cleaning supplies in my basket. At home, while David was in his office, I locked the bathroom door. I opened the shampoo bottle. The smell was familiar, comforting. The cream smelled sharp, wrong. My hands shook as I poured it in, mixing it carefully until nothing looked different. When I put the bottle back in its place, it looked harmless, normal. But I knew what it held. That night, I smiled. I laughed at the right moments. I asked about his work. Inside, I waited. The first 2 days, nothing happened. I checked the bottle obsessively. No change. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Then, on the 4th day, I lifted the bottle again. It was lighter. My mark confirmed it. Someone had used it. I sat on the edge of the tub, heart racing, nausea rolling through me. She had been here, and now there was no turning back. I didn't know who she was yet, but I knew something irreversible had begun, and soon the truth would step into the light in a way none of us could hide from.
The days that followed felt unreal, like I was moving through my life half asleep. I checked the shampoo bottle every morning, sometimes twice. I told myself to stop, that this obsession was unhealthy, but I couldn't. It had become proof, silent, undeniable proof that I wasn't imagining things. David showered as usual. He hummed sometimes. He seemed relaxed, almost lighter, and that frightened me more than anger would have. Then came Thursday evening. The television was on in the background while I worked on my laptop, barely listening. David wasn't home. Another late meeting, another production issue that couldn't wait. I was about to mute the TV when a name cut through the noise. Miriam Davies. My hands froze over the keyboard. The screen filled with flashing cameras and a familiar face stepping onto a red carpet in Los Angeles. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Miriam Davies, blonde, flawless, always perfectly styled, had no hair. Her scalp gleamed under the lights, partially hidden by a scarf that kept slipping as she moved. Reporters shouted questions. She avoided their eyes, her smile strained, almost panicked. The anchors speculated, a mysterious incident, a private mishap, an unexplained loss. My breath caught. The room felt smaller. In that instant, everything aligned. The blonde hair, the shampoo, the secrecy, the long nights, the woman who didn't belong in my bathroom but had stood there anyway. She had used my shampoo. I sat there, unable to move, as the segment ended and the show continued like nothing extraordinary had happened. But my life had split cleanly in two. The following days were relentless. Newspapers, online headlines, endless speculation. Miriam Davies shocks fans with sudden hair loss.
health scare, or behind-the-scenes sabotage. Hollywood whispers of a private scandal. Photos everywhere, scarves, wigs, avoided questions. I read every article, my stomach twisting tighter with each one. The truth was screaming at me from every screen, and yet inside my house there was silence. David said nothing. He came home late, distracted, avoiding my eyes. His conversations were rushed, filled with unnecessary details. He talked to fill space, not to connect. I watched him closely. When Miriam's face appeared on television, something flickered across his expression. Recognition, fear, guilt. He thought I didn't notice. At dinner one night, he suddenly stopped eating. "Ava," he started, then fell silent. I met his gaze calmly. "Yes?" He looked away. "Nothing." But I knew then, he knew I knew. The next morning, I placed the newspaper on the kitchen table between our coffee cups. Miriam's photo stared up at us. "Do you know her?" I asked lightly. His hand froze mid-reach. His face emptied of color. "To work," he said finally. "Barely." Barely. The word burned. The news cycle exploded. Talk shows debated, doctors speculated, stylists weighed in. But I didn't need theories. I had lived the truth. At the coffee shop, strangers whispered about her. Some pitied her. Others dismissed it as a publicity stunt. I stayed silent, carrying knowledge that felt both powerful and poisonous. At home, David retreated further. Phone calls behind closed doors, long hours in his office. We passed each other like polite strangers. On Sunday morning, another headline stared back at me, this time from a serious paper. No gossip, just facts and speculation. I placed it on the table again. David didn't say a word, and in that silence, something inside me hardened. If he wouldn't speak, I would. That Tuesday evening, I stood in the doorway of the living room. David sat in his chair, wine in hand, pretending to read. "We need to talk," I said. "Not now," he replied tiredly. "Now." He set the glass down. I told him everything I had seen. The hair, the shampoo, the lies. When I pushed the newspaper toward him, he finally broke. "It happened," he whispered. The words landed like a final blow. "How long?" I asked. He hesitated. "A few months." I laughed, hollow and bitter. A few months of betrayal in my home. The fight that followed tore everything open. Accusations, tears, words meant to wound. And beneath it all, grief for what we had lost long before that moment. The next day, I walked into a law office downtown. Divorce. And press. On the subway ride home, I cried quietly, unnoticed by everyone around me. But beneath the tears, there was clarity. This was the end. And maybe, finally, the beginning. Rehook. End of part 3. I thought speaking out would bring closure, but when my story went public, it changed my life in ways I never expected, including bringing someone unexpected into my path. The morning the article hit the stands, I felt as though the entire city had exhaled in unison and was now staring at me. I pulled the newspaper from the mailbox with trembling hands. The headline screamed at me. "Ava Miller, wife of production manager David Miller, speaks out on Hollywood scandal." The words beneath it were mine, my account of months of suspicion, betrayal, and discovery, printed in black and white. I felt a strange mix of relief and vulnerability. The secret I had carried for so long was finally exposed, and yet the exposure didn't make me feel small, it made me feel seen. In the cafe later that morning, I noticed the difference immediately. People glanced my way longer than usual. Some whispered, some stared. A barista smiled, but her eyes lingered. Even strangers on the street seemed to recognize me, not just as a face, but as the woman whose story had made headlines. It was unsettling, but it was also empowering. I was no longer the silent observer in my own life. Then came the calls and messages. Most were from the media, reporters asking for statements, clarifications, commentary, but one in particular stood out. "Miss Miller," it read, Thank you for trusting me. I'd like to meet and hear your story in your own words. Mark Stevens, a reporter, yes, but there was a calm sincerity in his emails that set him apart. When we finally met at a small West End cafe, it wasn't the press. It was just two people sitting across from each other. Thank you for coming, he said quietly, shaking my hand. Not the formal, probing tone of an interviewer, but something warmer. I know this isn't easy. I nodded, taking a deep breath. I had never confided in anyone like this before. Not the truth, not the fear, not the betrayal, but something about his presence made it possible. I told him everything: the blonde hair, the disappearing shampoo, the suspicion that had consumed me, the plan I had executed to catch the intruder, and finally the television moment when Miriam Davies appeared, bald, exposed, undeniable. Mark listened without judgment, no interruption, just questions when clarification was necessary. When I finished, my voice broken, he handed me a napkin silently. No pity, no judgment, just acknowledgement. The article went live 2 days later. My words, my story, my voice. Reading it in my kitchen, I felt a surge I hadn't felt in years. Relief, strength, a sense of reclaiming control over my life. The silence that had once suffocated me was replaced with a resonance I could almost touch. David said nothing. At home, he avoided me even more, retreating to his office, taking long calls. His attempts at casual conversation now felt hollow, weighed down by the inevitability of exposure. I didn't need to ask. I didn't need to confront him. The truth had already done the work. But in the midst of the media storm, there was another presence. Mark, not the reporter, the person. He reached out not for quotes, but for companionship, a simple invitation: coffee, walks, conversation without the specter of public scrutiny. At first, I hesitated. I was wounded, wary, not sure who I could trust, but eventually I accepted. Our first meeting was quiet, a small cafe, rain drizzling outside. We spoke of trivialities first: Austin weather, cappuccino quality, a stray dog in the park. Slowly, we ventured into more fragile territory: the impact of betrayal, of secrecy, of living in silence. He listened, really listened, and for the first time, I felt understood, not pitied, not judged. Over the following weeks, our connection grew, fragile but undeniable. Walks in Zilker Park, laughter over spilled coffee, silent movie nights where our hands hovered near each other but never touched fully. It was nothing official, nothing tangible, but it was a thread of possibility I hadn't felt in years. One evening, standing alone in my bathroom, I stared at my reflection: my dark hair, my tear-streaked eyes, the face of someone who had suffered and survived. I whispered to myself, I am no longer the woman who waited. I am no longer the one who stays silent. I am more. The divorce hadn't been finalized yet. My heart still bore the scars of 16 years, but I understood something vital. Endings can also be beginnings. Truth can hurt, but it can also set you free. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was reclaiming not just my life, but my story. I had exposed the betrayal, reclaimed my voice, and begun to step into a life I could shape. But the question lingered: could I trust again? Could I allow myself to embrace the possibility of something new and risk being vulnerable all over again?
Spring had begun to soften the edges of the months that had felt so harsh. The air in Austin carried the scent of blooming pecan trees, a reminder that life moved forward, even when hearts were bruised. The divorce papers arrived quietly, a formal stack of paper that ended 16 years of marriage. I had cried, yes, but it was no longer the raw despair of betrayal. It was a quiet release. David faded from my life like a shadow at sunset. His presence was gone, but the memory lingered in small ways. A lingering scent of his cologne, the hum of his voice in my mind, a shadow in the corner of a room. Yet I no longer felt anger in the same way. Anger had been replaced with clarity. I had survived. I had uncovered the truth, and most importantly, I had reclaimed my own life. Mark became a subtle, steady presence, not a replacement for the past, not a promise of anything certain, but a reminder that trust could exist again.
if only in fragments at first. Our walks through Zilker Park became a ritual of quiet connection, small gestures of companionship that didn't need to be defined. A shared laugh over a dog jumping into the river, a pause during a movie, hands almost touching but not yet. It was nothing official, but it was enough. The public attention slowly receded. Miriam Davies disappeared from the tabloid frenzy, retreating into the private world she had once shared with David. Seeing her in magazines or online no longer stirred anger or triumph. It stirred a neutral awareness. The scandal had run its course. What remained for me was the peace that came with knowledge and the freedom to move forward. One evening, wrapped in a blanket on my balcony, glass of wine in hand, I watched the sun set over the rooftops of Austin. Pink and gold streaked the sky, and for the first time in years, I felt a gentle sense of optimism. I thought of the young woman who had said yes at 19, full of hope and naivety. I thought of the months of doubt, sleepless nights, and quiet detective work, and I thought of the moment I chose not to stay silent. Every hardship, every betrayal, every tear had led to this clarity. I was no longer defined by silence. I was no longer defined by the past. I was defined by my courage, by my willingness to face the truth, and by my capacity to reclaim my voice. Mark sent a message that evening, casual, gentle. Coffee tomorrow? Just us. No notes, no headlines. I smiled, feeling warmth in my chest. Yes, I replied. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. New beginnings don't always shout. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the spaces left by endings. Later, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection. Dark hair, resilient eyes, a face that had seen pain and now carried strength. I whispered to myself, I am no longer the woman who waited. I am no longer the one who stays silent. I am more. And for the first time, I truly believed it. The future was uncertain. I didn't know where my path with Mark would lead, friendship, companionship, or perhaps love. But I no longer feared the unknown. I had learned a crucial lesson. Silence destroys, but truth sets you free. And freedom, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. The weeks passed, and spring fully blossomed. Coffee in quiet cafes, walks in blooming parks, evenings spent in the gentle glow of lamplight. Small moments stitched together into a tapestry of calm. I learned to live in the present, unbound by past betrayals or fears of the future. And sometimes, when the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, I would pause, breathe deeply, and think of everything I had endured. The young bride who had trusted too easily, the weary wife who had uncovered betrayal, the determined woman who had reclaimed her life, and now the woman who could stand in her own strength, face the world, and know that endings are not always final. They are merely the threshold to something new. I didn't exactly know what awaited me next, but I was ready. I was no longer silent. I was no longer waiting, and that in itself was everything. Ava's story reminds us all, betrayal can break us, but it can also awaken our strength. Silence may feel safe, but truth, however painful, sets you free. And sometimes the courage to speak and act is the beginning of a life you never imagined you could have.